Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. The new episode of our Speaking of Mississippi podcast features an interview with Berkeley Hudson on the Columbus photographer O.N. Pruitt. You can listen to it and episodes featuring conversations with Joshua Rothman, Jennifer Bond, Bobby Rush, and many others on the department's website or wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you'll come back next Wednesday for History's Lunch when we'll have Scott Beretta and Bobby Whalen to present Mississippi Folklife and the Civil Rights Movement, which is also the title of the online exhibit that the Mississippi Arts Commission has put up and that they're both a part of. Today, we are delighted to welcome Robbie Ethridge to present The Indian Slave Trade and the Transformation of Native North America. Robbie Ethridge is professor of anthropology at the University of Mississippi. She earned her BS, MA, and PhD degrees in anthropology from the University of Georgia. Ethridge is the author of From Chicaza to Chickasaw, The European Invasion and the Transformation of the Mississippian World, 1540 to 1715, and Creek Country, The Creek Indians and Their World, 1796 to 1816. She's the editor of 4 anthologies and has written numerous articles and book chapters on the history and ethnography of Native peoples of the American South. Ethridge is co-author with Robert Miller of the forthcoming University of Oklahoma Press book, A Promise Kept, The Muskogee Creek Nation, and the End of the Trail of Tears. Help me welcome Robbie Ethridge.
Okay, make sure we're all good here with the audio. So, first of all, hello, and thanks for coming out today. Beautiful day to be inside, huh? So first of all, I'd like to thank Chris for inviting me to participate in the History is Lunch program, and also to all of those folks who are responsible for putting this program together. I looked on the website before I was asked to come to this, and I was really impressed with what they've done here. And of course, I love visiting the 2 museums. This is all I can say is world class. Let me get my little thing here. Okay. The story of the European invasion into North America centers on the collision of 2 worlds. The emerging imperial world of Europe with its nascent global capital economy and the centuries-old world of American Indians. In 1500, Indian life in North America was lived out in a purely indigenous world. But by 1680, Native peoples lived on the edge of an expanding and conflict-ridden European world and in a new social landscape that included not only Indians, but also Europeans and Africans. The meeting of the American and European worlds propelled Native peoples, as well as Europeans and Africans, into a time of profound social transformation. Now, the disturbances in Indian life in the 16th and 17th centuries have not been difficult to identify. The archaeological and documentary evidence attest to the disappearance of native polities, the movements of people into tightly compacted and heavily fortified towns, and a dramatic loss of life, multiple migrations and splintering of groups, the coalescence of some, and the disappearance of many others. Despite such disruptions, though, Indians did not disappear. And across the continent, Native people responded to the European invasions in myriad ways, from things such as violence and resistance to accommodation and negotiation. And many Native groups coalesced into these large, formidable polities that would profoundly affect much about how the history of America unfolded over the next 300 years. Some of the forces that caused these disruptions and subsequent transformations include things such as the military losses and cultural exchanges with early Spanish colonizers, the introduction of Old World diseases, and the consequences of political and economic incorporation into the modern world economy. And although one can point to generalities such as these as the causes underlying the transformation of Native America with European contact, The impact of the European invasions actually played out differently in different regions and for different Indian polities and social groups. So the full transformation of the native world then must be viewed against a larger interpretive framework so that each instance of collapse and restructuring can be understood as a distinctive phenomena. So basically what I'm saying here is that the pre-colonial world of native North America is transformed with European contact, and that's what I'm going to look at today. Now, scholars have begun constructing such a framework for the American South, the arena where the most dramatic early encounters occurred. And to give a shameless plug to my books, which are on sale over here, we call this, at this time in the American South, the Mississippian Shatter Zone. And I've used this regional frame for integrating events and people from the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic into a single interactive world. The Mississippian Shatter Zone, however, was not the only shatter zone created in the early years of colonialism. And disruptions to native life were likely more dramatic in the American South than in other areas of North America. But we can identify other shatter zones in other areas of the continent. Now, Spain would spearhead the colonial project in North America, and the largest efforts launched by Spain in the first half of the 16th century were the Hernando de Soto expedition into the present-day American South, and in 1539, the Francisco Vázquez de Coronado campaign into the present-day American Southwest. And the Coronado expedition was in 1540. Both expeditions inaugurated a series of changes to native North American life that would grow in intensity over the next 150 years. In the South, De Soto landed in present-day Tampa, Florida, before moving north and west. And the De Soto expedition explored the southern heartland, but failed to establish a colony. Coronado, on the other hand, moved from present-day Mexico into the American Southwest, venturing as far as eastern Kansas, but he too failed in establishing a permanent Spanish presence in the area. At the time, in the American South, Native people were organized into what archaeologists call chiefdoms. Now, the chiefdom is a term that denotes a hierarchically organized political unit with an hereditary elite leadership. Now, these are the people who built the large temple mounds one finds throughout the South. I'm sure many of you are acquainted with those if you haven't actually visited some of the sites here in the Mississippi. There is the Mound Trail, after all. De Soto's Entrada encountered dozens of chiefdoms in the Southeast. These chiefdoms were relatively small, although chiefdoms sometimes joined together into confederations of larger military and political proportions called complex and paramount chiefdoms. Most prominent of the latter were the Appalachia of Florida, Coffee in South Carolina, Coosa in Georgia and Alabama, and Tuscaloosa in central Alabama. And also, though there were several large and bellicose chiefdoms along the Mississippi River, such as Caskey, Anlico, Keequatom, and others. Native peoples in the Southwest, on the other hand, were organized into independent farming pueblos, some with large population centers that numbered in the thousands, such as Zuni, Hopi, Tequah, Pecos, Yemez, Taos, and Acoma. Now, both Coronado and De Soto depended on the food stores of Native people to feed their armies and the livestock in their expeditions. Because of his large force and his need for local supplies, Coronado made extended stays at the largest of the pueblos, especially with the Zuni, the Hopi, and the Tequah. De Soto, too, spent entire winters with local chiefdoms, including the chiefdom of Chicaza, which is here in northeastern Mississippi. Such extended stays and the ransacking of entire regions for food led to depletions of local resources, which had quite serious repercussions. Now, Native people obviously knew much about utilizing wild plant and animal foods, but a shortage of stored cultivated crops, such as corn and beans and so on, would have meant hardship for all and starvation for some. Plus, the leadership of Native polities at this time partly derived from being able to procure and secure stores of food for these kinds of emergencies. And if the leadership failed on this count, polities would have also been subjected to political unrest. Now, De Soto's army came as a conquering army. And in the cases of those chiefdoms that saw intense military action, the direct assault of the Spanish may have precipitated their collapse. The Coronado expedition also encountered native resistance and on more than one occasion engaged in large-scale warfare, such as that at Tigua, in which whole pueblos were destroyed and many of the inhabitants killed or scattered. One can see that in both cases, geopolitical landscapes were reconfigured when towns were destroyed or abandoned, political alliances reshuffled, and local leadership strained or usurped. Both the Coronado and De Soto expeditions were the first hammer in the creation of these shatter zones. Now, disease and incorporation to the modern world economy came on the heels of these early encounters. Immediately after the Coronado and De Soto expeditions, the Spanish launched a handful of Catholic missions to convert the Indians in present-day Florida and South Georgia and the Southwest to the Catholic faith. As they launched these missions, the friars focused mostly on those aspects of native life that conflicted directly with Catholicism, things such as polygamy, polytheism, adultery, or worshiping native deities, and curiously, the Indian ball game. The friars and Spanish officials, however, did not attempt to topple local leadership. Instead, what they wanted to do was to co-opt native leaders in order to establish Spanish authority with them and to conscript Indian labor for growing corn, building facilities, maintaining new roadways, and so on. This labor system of these missions, however, undermined Indian health and well-being. For example, recent bioarchaeological studies have revealed that the Indian populations across Spanish Florida suffered from malnutrition, severe and physically damaging labor practices, as well as other associated health risks from displacement into labor camps. Native peoples in both the Southwest and Southeast became quickly disaffected with life in the Spanish missions, and violent native revolts punctuated the entire mission periods, evidence that unrest and discontent existed among large numbers of these so-called missionized Indians. However, in addition, with increased contacts between Europeans and Indians, Old World diseases began to circulate through North America. Exactly when introduced diseases made their first appearances in North America is very difficult to discern. The earliest concrete evidence for disease in the Southeast and Southwest comes from the records of these Spanish missions from the early 17th century. And these records leave little doubt to the widespread occurrence of Old World diseases among the Indians to whom the friars administered. And disease also made its way into the Northeast. In the late 16th century, European explorers, fishermen, traders, privateers, and others trafficked with local Indians along the coast of New England and eastern Canada. And there's some evidence that the Indians with whom they had contact may have contracted diseases such as influenza and dysentery. The first well-documented case, though, of widespread disease in the Northeast occurred after the French, Dutch, and English settled in the area. And this occurrence was from 1616 to 1619. And during this time, Indians from present-day Maine to Massachusetts suffered from an introduced ailment, and scores of people died. Further south along the mid-Atlantic coast, English settlers at Roanoke and Jamestown undoubtedly infected their Indian neighbors in the first few decades of the 17th century. And as colonization and trade intensified, so did the disease episodes. And disease began to spread along the trade routes European and Indian traders were canvassing. By about 1650, disease had spread from the east, the north, and the west to meet at the Mississippi River, thus infiltrating much of North America. Indian populations from Old World diseases in the 17th century have been very, very difficult to calculate, and the estimates range from 30 to 90%. Now, current interpretations conclude that although population losses could be severe in an area, there's no evidence for a catastrophic loss of life across North America before sustained European contact. What we think now is that epidemics occurred, obviously, but they were localized, albeit with high mortality rates. And the epidemics were also serial, occurring with regularity about every 7 to 10 years, and carrying off approximately 20 to 30% of a local population at a time. So in other words, disease was very widespread, but it was localized. It wasn't this, catastrophic pandemic. We all know about pandemics, right? And it does not look to have occurred like that. Today, scholars still accept a 90% loss of native life after contact, but this loss now appears to have occurred over about a 200-year span from roughly 1550 to 1750, and in a gradual, as you can see here on the red line on this chart, in a gradual and not steep demographic decline, and only after sustained European contact. In addition, scholars agree that disease was but one factor in the demographic decline, and they now point to contributing things such as incorporation into the modern world economy, slaving, chronic warfare, dropping fertility rates, violent colonial strategies such as genocide, and general cultural and social malaise from colonial oppression. Now, certainly the introduction of old world disease epidemics and cultural exchanges and violent exchanges with early Spaniards had profound effects on native life. But as I argue, these instabilities, epidemics, and exchanges in and of themselves were not transforming. Rather, it was the engagement of native peoples in the world economy through contact with the English, French, and Dutch that was the final hammer to complete the shatter zones. And native peoples adapted and survived by revamping their social, political, and economic orders. With the economic decline of Spain and Portugal in the late 16th century, the European nations of France, England, and the Netherlands began an intense competition through colonization for global economic supremacy. The English, Dutch, and French colonies in the 17th and early 18th centuries established strategic commercial outposts really throughout the world. And through these outposts, they vied for and extracted labor and resources. The North American ventures in particular were just one set of commercial endeavors among a host of many others that crisscrossed the globe. And these early North American settlements served mostly as extractive trade factories. These are the early years, the early 17th century. Now, these settlements may have been small and overwhelmed by Indian populations, but they were a conduit through which the economic power of the core countries flowed. Hence, one should not look on the early American colonies and colonists themselves as wielding extraordinary transforming powers. Rather, it was the system in which they served that was so transformative. It was not Quebec, Albany, Plymouth, Jamestown, or Charlestown that created colonial shatter zones. It was the global commercial power of the Netherlands, France, and England as funneled through these settlements. Each colonial outpost competed with the others to establish their commercial networks. And in every case, their very first commercial ventures included inaugurating a trade with local Indians. And soon, several of these outposts became flourishing cities founded on commerce with Indians across the eastern woodlands. European entrepreneurs engaged local Indians in trading beaver, deer, and other animal skins and furs. In addition to skins and furs, early European traders kept up a brisk trade in Indian slaves. Slavery, though, was not new to North American Indians at contact, and most native groups practiced a form of indigenous slavery in which war captives sometimes were put into bondage. Large-scale captive taking, as occurred during the 17th and early 18th centuries, however, was most likely not conducted during the pre-contact era, but came about with a colonial commercial slave trade. In other words, we see an escalation in the number of people being enslaved at this time. Now, as in pre-contact slavery, the commercial slaves sold on the commercial market were obtained in war through raiding and the capturing of prisoners. In other words, they were war captives who were put into bondage. Now, in warfare, male captives were usually killed, as in the pre-contact days, but now non-combatants, women and children, were spared and taken as war captives. The fate of war captives varied. Captors sometimes consigned them to forced labor with no social rights. In some cases, captors adopted captives into a kin group, used them in prisoner exchanges with their foes, married them, gave them as gifts of alliance, obtained ransoms for them, or used them to forge trade alignments. By far, though, the vast majority of captives after contact were sold to Europeans, who either kept them as slaves or sold them on the Atlantic slave market. The commercial trade in Indian slaves provides a window into the transformative power of the modern world economy. In the slave trade, Indian groups were responding to a dynamic wherein Indian men incurred debts when they accepted guns, ammunition, metal tools, and other items from European traders. European traders, in turn, requested that the debt be paid in slaves and skins. Now armed with European-manufactured weapons, Indian groups raided rival Indian groups for slaves. Members of the unarmed group would then have to acquire guns with which to defend themselves, and they, in turn, would become slave raiders. The result was this vicious cycle of slaving, trading, and weapons escalation. So, what did Indians get in exchange for their animal skins and human commodities? Well, the evidence points to any number of items, including cloth, brass and copper objects, steel knives, blades, fish hooks, iron hoes and axes, beads, bells, and alcohol. By far, though, the items most desired were guns and ammunition. There's a standing question about why Indians wanted these new armaments. I mean, after all, they were skilled bowmen and they were skilled military men. And it's especially unclear whether owning these early trade guns gave any group a military edge. In other words, these early trade guns were not that lethal of a weapon. Opinions are divided. Some scholars understand that these weapons, no matter how poorly made or ineffective, still would have revolutionized Indian warfare. Others, though, have proposed that Indian men sought them as status symbols and not as implements of combat. In either case, one thing is certain. When guns became available, Indian people went to extraordinary lengths to acquire them. In fact, in many cases, Native people were so intent on gaining and controlling access to these trade items that their commercial ambitions came to dominate many aspects of their lives. These results would transform Native America. Now, the concept of the shatter zone, as the name implies, takes violence to be attendant to imperialism and the birth of the early modern world. It also takes violence to be part and parcel of capitalist incorporation. Indigenous peoples who lived and participated in the colonial world also contributed to, and sometimes even created, this colonial violence. This is especially true when indigenous people became involved in commercial slave trading. Of all the types of colonial commerce, the commercial trade in slaves required a high level of force as a necessary accompaniment to trade, because after all, it was war captives that one was trading. In other words, whereas trading in, say, furs or skins did not necessarily involve warfare, trading and slaving did, because it required force. Certainly, warfare penetrated Indian life throughout North America before contact. So much so that war, not peace, may have been the accepted state of affairs. Once Europeans arrived, however, one can see that native war efforts became entwined with market interest and international commerce. And as warfare became tied to commercial interest, indigenous mechanisms for mitigating war and brokering peace broke down. An initial result of integration into the market economy was a generation of what I call militaristic Indian societies. These are Indian groups who held control of the trade through militarism. In addition, Europeans exploited this intra-Indian hostility and fanned the flames of war in order to keep the trade flowing. In short, as Indian commercial interest in the colonial Indian trade intensified, so did warfare and the militarization of those native groups who sought to control the trade. The result was the creation of these shatter zones, these large regions of widespread dislocation, migration, amalgamation, and in some cases, extinction of other native peoples. The Iroquois, who lived in present-day upstate New York, are perhaps the most famous example of a militaristic Indian society. When the Dutch settled Albany, the Iroquois understood the Dutch presence to open an opportunity for them for unfettered access to the trade, and they began a series of wars against any groups blocking their way to the European trade centers. Iroquois warfare, however, was predicated on an older convention of what's called the mourning wars, and that's M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, as if you're grieving. In these mourning wars, Iroquois sought Indian captives to replace their dead through a ceremony known as requickening. However, when commercial activity expanded during the 17th century, and when Iroquois deaths from introduced diseases climbed, the Iroquois mourning wars gained new meaning. Their goals proliferated and came to include the acquisition of hunting lands and the creation of a monopoly power over commodities like beaver skins, and of course, the slave trade. The Mohicans took the first blow, and they were eliminated by 1628. The Iroquois successfully dispersed the Montagnais, the Algonquins, and refugees fled to the Hurons and joined the Hurons. By 1649, Iroquois attacks in the so-called Beaver Wars led to the breaking apart of the Hurons and their allies, the Petuns, Neutrals, Winrows, and Eries. Iroquois warriors also dealt a severe blow to the Susquehannas and drove them into an alliance with the British in Maryland. So in other words, the Iroquois warfare spread throughout Northeast and into the Great Lakes area. So even those groups outside of the sphere of Iroquois wars suffered an increase in warfare, hostility, and raiding for captives and slaves. When the British settled the colonies of New England, Indians such as the Narragansett, Wampanoags, Micmacs, Pequots, Munsees, Delaware, and Abenakis entered into trade agreements with the British and the Dutch. However, relations inevitably frayed over time because of continued losses from disease, the demands put on local Indians by European traders and settlers, and the colonists' increasing appetite for Indian lands. 17th century native New England was marked by a series of debilitating disease epidemics and Indian wars, such as the Pequot War, Kief's War, the Peach War, the Esopus Wars, and King Philip's War. In addition to the high death tolls from all this warfare, hundreds of captives from these wars were sold to Europeans and Indian slavers and shipped to the Caribbean. In the American Southwest, Indian captives and slaves circulated among both Indians and Spaniards, where they became as integral to the economy as later black slaves were in the American South. The Pueblo Indians had long established trade relations with Plains and Great Basin hunters and gatherers, such as the Utes, the Navajos, and the Apaches. And captives had been one of the exchange items in this circuit, and they had been since pre-contact times. But with the presence of the Spanish, and especially with the growing demand for Indian laborers for Spanish colonists and in the Spanish mining operations in northern Mexico, raiding for captives increased dramatically in the late 16th and throughout the 17th centuries. And in addition to the nomadic groups, when the nomadic groups acquired horses, they became mounted raiders, and they became even more formidable, which you can see in this slide. The Utes, Navajos, and Apaches raided the Pueblo Indians, but the Pueblo Indians also raided the nomads. By the late 17th century, Apache raiders also assaulted groups farther removed, going as far as East Texas and western Louisiana to raid the Caddo. In many cases, Indian slaves and captives were taken in as kin or concubines by both Indians and Spaniards, weaving a network of kinship that cross-cut ethnic lines and built a unique multi-ethnic social nexus. Even so, the violence begat by the rampant raiding for slaves underlay the region, and Indians turned on other Indians as well as Spaniards, so the whole of the Southwest again was embroiled in much violence and conflict. Slaving also made its way into the French territories in and around the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. With the Huron control broken, the Ottawas, Potawatomis, and Ojibwa Indians from the upper Great Lakes stepped into the breach and became vital to the French fur and slave trade. The groups in the Illinois Confederacy in the Midwest had early on understood the importance of the Mississippi River as both a north-south trade corridor and also the gateway to the West. In the early 17th century, they placed themselves in the strategic arc along the middle and upper Mississippi River. And by the middle of the 17th century, they controlled the trade throughout the Midwest, and they consolidated politically into what we know as the Illinois. They became fearsome slavers, raiding groups to the south, north, east, and west, and as far south as into Mississippi. Iroquois raiders, going back to the Iroquois, were at this time seeking to extend their hunting and slaving range, and they came up against this Illinois bulwark, and they waged a brutal war against them for over 20 years. The Iroquois also launched raids against the Miamis and any other former enemies who had moved into the region. They also leveled attacks against the Ojibwas, Ottawas, and others involved in the French trade. And their raiding, too, even took them as far south as the Chickasaw country, again, here in present-day northern Mississippi. Indian slaves derived from these conflicts circulated through New France and were oftentimes adopted by their Indian captors and used in alliance building, but most were sold to French colonists who used them as guides, concubines, domestic servants, trade house laborers, as well as in prisoner exchanges for alliance building. Indian slavers also swept across the eastern woodlands, selling thousands of Indian slaves to Dutch, English, and French slave traders and decimating hundreds of Indian communities, with the survivors fleeing in all directions and seeking protection with each other as they began to coalesce into the Hurons, Ojibwa, Illinois, and so on. In the American South, however, Indian people suffered the brunt of the Indian slave trade. Here, Charlestown and Jamestown traders first enlisted as slavers a Piedmont group known as the Occaneechees, and also the Westo Indians, who were a group of Eries fleeing Iroquois slave raiders who had migrated first to Virginia and then to the Savannah River and present-day Georgia. From 1650 to 1680, the Westos and Occaneechees controlled the trade throughout the South and terrorized Indians across the region through their incessant slave raiding. Then the Occaneechees were diminished in Bacon's Rebellion, a conflict that has recently been cast as an Indian trade war. Then, in 1680, a group of Charlestown entrepreneurs who wanted to open the trade to other southeastern groups and break this Westo monopoly hired a group of mercenary Shawnees who had moved to the Savannah River to extirpate the Westos. When the Westos were now gone, Charlestown traders fanned across the South, enlisting as slave traders groups such as the Apalachicola, Hitchites, Tallapooses, Abicas, and Alabamas, groups who would later form the Creek Confederacy, as well as the Chickasaws, the Catawbas, Yamasees, Cherokees, and Shawnees. So now virtually every major group in the South was now slaving. They raided French and Spanish allied Indians as well as each other, as slaving really just spun out of control. Tens of thousands of Indians were put into bondage. In the South, European slavers shipped Indian slaves to the West Indies and South America to work on the plantations and in the mines, as well as throughout the American colonies to New England, French Canada, and French Louisiana, where they were used as domestic servants, urban laborers, and sometimes in small-scale agricultural labor. Scores, though, were also sold to planters and others in Jamestown and Charlestown. And here, Indian slaves began to meld their lives with African slaves. Most, however, were shipped off-continent to never again see their homelands. Between 1540 and 1715, virtually every chiefdom in the pre-contact Southeast failed, and the survivors regrouped and reorganized themselves into the Creeks, Cherokees, Catawbas, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Yamasees, and so on. So in other words, the polities that Hernando de Soto saw were gone, and the people had regrouped and reconstituted themselves into these new groups that we know today as the Chickasaws, Cherokee, Choctaws, and so on. These were large, formidable, what we call coalescent societies. They were town-centered, council-driven political systems made up of disparate people from disparate places. Their world and their polities were quite different from that of their pre-colonial ancestors. Now, the incorporation of indigenous people into the modern world economy through the Indian slave trade, as we saw, did not proceed peacefully or calmly. Rather, wherever and whenever market forces appeared on the scene through European colonization, the result was always political turmoil, cultural upheaval, dislocation, and social transformation. Still, despite the violence, disruption, and displacements, one should remember that shatter zones did not destroy Native peoples. The violence and disruption of this era was also generative. It produced new social and cultural forms. For instance, the Iroquois in Illinois grew in regional importance and power as they became active participants and partners in the European trade system and vanquished their Indian competitors. In many cases, displaced and scattered people coalesced to form new kinds of social groups and formed large nations, such as the coalescent societies of the American South. The mechanisms of coalescence are only now coming to light. In other words, we don't really know what drew these different people together into these different polities, nor do we really understand fully the glue that held them together. Things such as marriage, adoption, linguistic affiliation, and perhaps former pre-contact alliances were used as that glue. In the coalescent societies, we see that people rebuilt their communities and constructed new and political organizations using some social institutions that resembled those of their pre-colonial polities. In other words, they brought forward some of that pre-colonial chiefly era structures. But in many cases, the new societies maintain, so in many cases, they maintained in practices, these old practices, such as town councils, blood revenge, reciprocity, the clan organization, corn agriculture, their hunting and gathering activities, and their kinship systems. And all of these had roots in the pre-contact times. These institutions and practices, in fact, proved to be highly adaptable and could be integrated into this new global economic situation. Other institutions, however, were transformed. Gender relations, for example, changed as men's labor became devoted to market pursuits, and women, too, sought participation in the market through marriage to Europeans and through expanding their own domestic economies. The European trade system also worked to transform indigenous leadership institutions by promoting internal factionalism and by redefining the basis of power and authority from one of succession through kinship and religious sanction to one of economic prowess and international diplomatic skills. So basically what we see is that this hereditary chieftainship, especially in the Mississippian and in the American South, dissolves and is replaced by a more acquired status, men who showed their abilities in diplomatic skills and in trade and dealing with Europeans. Now, as this brief survey shows, not just in the Southeast, but across the American continent, the Indians of the late 17th century were not simply 16th century people reduced in number and moved forward in time, nor were they people busily fastening European traits onto ancient sociological and cultural frames. Rather, they, like all people, were shaped by the large and small forces of history. They were a synthesis of their past, their present, and their future. They were of the old and of the new. They were a new kind of people living in a new kind of world that, like other parts of the world, were continually being shaped and reshaped by the global economy, changing indigenous cultural elements, and the harsh realities of new opportunities afforded by European colonization and expansion. So, thank y'all. Let's put this up here. So, we got any questions? We'll have a discussion if anybody wants.
If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Yeah, Chris will let you talk so you can be heard over the
That's right.
The stuff, the digital stuff.
I can always come up with a question. Your first slide, you show the Europeans chopping off the hands of the native peoples.
Right, let me go back to that so we can get back there pretty quick.
Similar to what was done with the Africans by chopping off their feet so they could not escape. The Indians, of course, were more familiar with the terrain. Why did they chop off their hands?
These were, in this case, these would be war trophies for one thing. So they're taking them as trophies. And in this case, to disable them, so they, especially the men, so they wouldn't be able to fight, right? And for Indian Indians taking Indian slaves, they had to be able to walk to their destination, to the ports, because most of these Indians were captured in the interior, and the infrastructure at the time required them to, there was no horses, or not many horses and things like that, or wagons and whatnot. So slaves had to actually walk to the port cities, so they couldn't really disfigure them, and so much so that they wouldn't be able to walk, because they had to walk to the port cities, which could be hundreds of miles in some cases. But yeah, it was very brutal. There's no doubt about it. And let me add to this, while we're talking about this, men, Indian men, and I speak mostly about the Southeast because that's what I know best, but some of this is generalizable to all of Native North America. But certainly in the South, Indian men were trained since about the age of 3 to be warriors. And so capturing a warrior, capturing a male for a captive was dangerous business because he was also trained to escape. And in that escape, he would kill his captors. So it was always dangerous to take men alive. And plus, most of those men would have fought to the death. In other words, they would not have given up. So, so male captives would have been relatively rare, although they did occur. But at least during the slave trade era, the concentration was on women and kids, and of a certain age. So any kid, now a male over about 12 or 13 was too dangerous. He would have been trained in warfare. He would have been a dangerous male. But a smaller child could, but only a child that could walk 100 or so miles, a couple hundred miles. And women were taken, any older women would have been killed because they couldn't have made the journey. So women from childhood, about 8 to maybe into their 40s or even maybe older, were taken, which meant that most women were of childbearing age were taken as slaves, which would have impacted the fertility rates. In other words, this population collapse we see is not just due to disease, it's due to the exportation of all these women who, were the childbearers. So it was a nasty business, as we all know. She asked what the chores were. It varied. Now, if they were put into slavery in the South on these plantations, like in Jamestown or Charlestown, remember, this is early. This is like the 17th century. So those plantations were like the rice plantations in Charlestown, or perhaps the tobacco plantations in Jamestown in Virginia. They would have been set to do in the field chores, yeah. Now, some of those slaves who were put into slavery up north were used. There wasn't, of course, the plantation system up there, but those slaves were used in, small-scale agricultural labor. They were used as domestic servants. They were used in commercial servants, like working in a store, maybe in a warehouse, things like that. Most of the Indian slaves, though, were shipped off to the Caribbean and to Latin America, where they were worked to death on those plantations and in the mines. Spain had begun a series of mining operations in Latin America for mostly tin, but also silver and other things. And the Indian slaves were put to work in those mines. And Indian slaves, those mines and the plantation slavery in the Caribbean, as we all know, were just absolutely brutal, and those people would have been worked to death. And those folks would have also been very susceptible to disease. So their longevity, an Indian slave's longevity in the Caribbean or in Latin America would have been relatively short. In other words, they probably only worked maybe 5 years.
Were they in Mississippi at the time?
There wasn't any in Mississippi. This is before Mississippi is settled. Yeah, this is, the French come down the Mississippi River around 1680. So when the French finally settled down there in Biloxi and so forth, they didn't really, the plantation system had not really taken root at this time. That comes in a little bit later. I mean, that was mostly a military outpost. They had the forts there. Some people were beginning to import slaves and to start plantations, but that would have been around Biloxi, Mobile area. It had been very small at this time. I'm pretty early. This is the 17th century, mostly. It's later that, well, yeah, but they got started much later. Yeah, they got started much later with African slaves. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned missionaries while you were talking, and I thought about the movie Black Robe. I don't know if you've seen that. It came out a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I wondered how historians look back at that movie in terms of how it depicted Native Americans. And then I wanted to know, what was the role of missionaries in terms of the wars that were taking place?
I can't really speak to how Native people see that movie. I've seen it, and it's hard to watch a historical fiction movie with me because I'm the one going, that felt like that didn't happen. You know, I drive my husband crazy. But actually that one is it's a fairly decent depiction. I mean, for a Hollywood movie, you know. It's not too exaggerated. It's not too biased. And it does, I think, depict the sort of the tortured relationship between those friars, those missionaries, and the native peoples. And by tortured, I mean it was just, sometimes it was good and benevolent and beneficial for all, and sometimes it was hostile and mean and horrible. So, you know, and they existed in that tension between those two. What was the other part of your question? Oh, right. Those friars meddled in native politics. They didn't try to depose the native leaders. In fact, they wanted them in position because the idea was we'll convert the leaders and then everybody else will convert because the leaders have converted. And it typically followed that pattern. But they also wanted to make sure that leaders, like when there was a transition, right, when there's a regime change, right, they wanted to make sure that leaders were in position, that were moving into new positions, were pro-Spanish, pro-mission. So they meddled in Indian affairs and Indian politics, and they sparked several conflicts because of that, because of their meddling in those things. The friars would not have promoted warfare ostensibly, right? But they would have supported, say, if one group was taking out revenge or vengeance on another group who the friars did not see as friendly. They could not supply them with guns. The Spanish and the friars, they were banned from supplying guns and ammunition, although there was a hefty black market in guns and ammunition, so guns were there, but not any numbers in those missions until, but not like what the French and the English and the Dutch brought in. But so they weren't like directly involved in all that warfare, but they were not innocent bystanders either, right? Go ahead.
Did enslavement in the Indian world, and I guess I have different phases, either pre-contact or within Indian organizations, enslavement post-contact, or when trafficked to Europeans, was it a hereditary status during any of these times? As I guess within about 50 years, African enslavement did become in North America. So I'm interested in was there a hereditary enslavement?
It's interesting you asked that. I was just reading a book in a book I was reading. It had a selection on that. As far as we know, in pre-contact times, we can't say for sure. However, it does look like it was not hereditary. In other words, if you were a war captive and put into slavery and you had children, now these were matrilineal societies, which meant that the children belonged to the female. So if you were a male captive or slave and having a child with a woman, that child would automatically be a part of the woman's group no matter what. Now if you're a woman slave having a kid, that child would be yours. But from what we can tell, and this is very difficult to parse out because you need all kinds of good DNA evidence and whatnot, but it does not look like it was hereditary. But that's what we think right now. When they are enslaved by when they are sold on the European slave market, yes, it would have been hereditary. Yeah, so there was a difference there. And those Indians who kept captives for their own slaves now later, when they started adopting African slaves, it became hereditary. Indian people had African slaves as well, and it was quasi-hereditary. But in this early time, Indian slaves was not hereditary. We know that. So, but with Europeans, it would have been.
I was wondering if the Dutch had a lot of money, because in every conflict, historical conflict, it seemed like the Dutch were there.
I agree with you 100%. The Dutch always sort of, escape scrutiny, right? And we haven't really paid them a lot of attention historically in American history, but that's changing a lot. In the last decade or so, there's been a fair amount of attention from American historians on the Dutch and what they did. And if you look across the globe, now the Dutch were in Albany only a few decades, right? And then they moved out. But then they moved out to other areas of the globe where they had, again, the African slave trade, over in the Pacific and Asia and all these other places around the world where and even in South America, they set up some pretty big operations, commercial slaving operations, as well as just commercial extractive operations where they're taking timber and, precious metals and whatnot. I know nothing. No, I have to. I mean, they were a big player in these early commercial endeavors, for sure. Mm-hmm. They just don't get much attention in the Americas because they weren't here that long, for one thing. But when they were here, they really created a lot of havoc up there in the Northeast and in Canada. Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much
for
your presentation. And you may have covered this, but in the 200-year 90% population decline, what are the numbers? Like percentages are one thing, but like, are there any information on really what is your starting point and how many?
The numbers have been super difficult to get at. Again, I think the most recent estimation for all of the hemisphere is about 50 million people, the whole hemisphere. Now, the area I know the best, the American South, the estimates run around 1 to 1.5 million at the time of European contact. By about 1720 in the American South, you've got probably about 80 or 90,000 native peoples left. And we know those numbers better because some census material is starting to show up. So colonists are going out and actually counting heads. So we have a better understanding in the 18th century, but those early numbers, they've been very, very difficult to get at. And we have to do it archaeologically by looking at how many sites were there, how many towns and villages, how many people in a town and village. And that's just almost impossible because, as any archaeologist here will attest, we just really simply, we have a good idea, reckoning of how many sites there are, but trying to put all that together and to come up with a population figure has been very, very difficult. But I'll say for the American South, it's running at about 1 to 1.5 million. And that number seems reasonable to me. It's a thin population distribution, right? I mean, it's not a lot of people through a big region like the South.
Hello, it's me again.
Hi.
This is wonderful work that you have done.
Oh, thank you.
The comparison that can be made between the Indian slave trade and the African slave trade is so close. These are peoples who were in their own land, enjoying their life and contributing to society, and they were invaded by European colonists who destroyed both nations, took the resources out of both nations and left them in shambles. This is why we need to study history, and you have done such an excellent job with just this one book. How did you, as a European American female, come to this work? What was your initial interest?
Well, I can trace it back to when I was a kid. When I was little, I was the one cheering for the Indians and the cowboy and Indian stuff. They were just so much more interesting to me than the cowboys. I don't know. Although I love cowboys too. I don't know what it was, but then I went to University of Georgia, and I came from a family with no education. I mean, I was one of the first to go to college, right? And so I ended up in anthropology class and ended up with Dr. Charles Hudson, who is like the guru of the southeastern ethnohistory, southeastern Indians. And I had no idea you could that you could make a living studying Indians. Oh my God, how fun is that? And so I did. And I came into it, I have to say, with a lot of ethnocentrism, a lot of bias. And I remember telling Dr. Hudson one time, Charlie, that you know, when he told me about when I started learning about this kind of stuff, and I thought, oh, I don't want to study those old violent Indians of the South. I want to go and study the Plains Indians, you know, with the headdresses and counting coup and gentle Indians. And Charlie was like, well, there's nothing I can do for you then, you know. And I realized then, and I see it now, that I was kind of having my own sort of culture shock, in that Native peoples, as I learned more about what they were actually like in the past, it wasn't anything like what in my imagination, right? In my own sort of stereotypical, you know, naive way of thinking about it. So, and then I got interested in capitalism and how capitalism affected indigenous peoples. And so those things all sort of wound their way into this. And then, but when I looked at capitalism, the first iteration of it in the South was through the slave trade. So that's kind of how I ended up looking at slavery, at Indian slave trade, was because I was interested in this world economy and how it impacted Native peoples. And, you know, like you said, the story is not too dissimilar from what happened in Africa, and I would have to dare say other areas of the world as well. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I would love to put together a session comparing the two, you know, comparing comparing African slave trade and the Indian slave trade. And I've had others, scholars and others who have been to presentations like this have mentioned that. But I haven't seen yet any big comparison between the two. But when I look at it, I see a lot of similarities. I see a lot of things that are worthy of comparison. There's also a lot of differences, right? I mean, and those need to be highlighted as well. So,
we have a question from the live stream. How did the Natchez fit in this transformation from the chiefdom structure to the coalescent communities?
Well, the Natchez were one of the chiefdoms that hung on to the bitter end. We see all these chiefdoms disappear by about 1680 or so, except the Natchez. And so across the American South, those chiefdoms have now disappeared, and people are regrouping into the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and so on. But the Natchez, and we really don't understand why, but somehow they managed to sustain as a chiefdom up until the Natchez Wars of the 1730s. It's been proposed that one reason is because the French wanted that political system, you know, that it benefited the French to have this centralized authority, because these coalescent societies, as I said, these were the council-driven, you know, headman-driven society, you know, political orders where there was no centralized chief or authority. But for the Natchez, there was, you know, the Great Sun. And so it benefited the French, so the French sort of tolerated them, and the Natchez were able to sustain for some reason, although we do think that they probably don't exactly resemble pre-contact chiefdoms, that they may be somewhat different than what a pre-contact chiefdom would have looked like. But of course, they didn't last long. I mean, they were, you know, extirpated in the Natchez Wars of the 1730s. And then they eventually, the remnants of them actually went and joined the Chickasaws, and they got run off, and then when they went and joined the Creeks. And I think they're still part of the Creek Confederacy, if I recall. Yeah.
We've come to the top of another hour. I know there are a few more questions, but I'll bet Robbie will be able to answer them right over here, where you can buy a copy of her book as well. We have copies of From Chicaza to Chickasaw for sale. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that you come back next week when we'll have Scott Beretta and Bobby Whalen talking with us. For now, help me thank Robbie Ethridge for this program.
Thank you. Appreciate it.